Today, on topic 9, we're going to be talking about classification. Now, with classification, there are different goals. So there's binomial nomenclature and systematics. With binomial nomenclature, binomial means to name, so binomial, and nomenclature is the naming of it. So each species is assigned a two-part scientific name, and then with systematics, it's how they organize living things into groups that have a specific biological meaning. Now, when they assign scientific names, they have to have an understanding and they have to be able to study diversity to describe each one, each species. So, with scientific names, biologists can be sure they're discussing the same animal. So, let's say we use common names like gato for cat. Um, gato, cat in Spanish, obviously gato and cat are the same thing. Now, if I say gato in Italy, then that means cake. Obviously, not the same thing. So, having scientific names can make it easier to speak to others with different languages and different locations. So, for example, names cougar, puma, panther, and mountain lion can all be used to indicate the exact same animal, which is Felis concolor. Felis has to do with cats. Concolor probably has to do with the coloring of those cats. Now, in the 18th century, European scientists, they all agreed to use Latin or Greek names to name each species. So early scientific names were before used to be describing that species in a lot of detail. So before, there used to be things for a tree. It was an oak with deeply divided leaves that have no hairs on their undersides and no teeth around their edges. Super long name that it's complicated, but also different scientists would focus on different characteristics. While me as a scientist would say the oak with the deeply divided leaves, maybe Miss Samayoa or another scientist would say, oh, it's an oak tree with really big leaves and they're not hairy. And like she would say it differently. So it depends specifically on scientists and what they look at characteristics. So it was better to standardize the names. Now, the Swedish botanist in 1730, Carolus Linnaeus, he developed the two-word naming system called binomial nomenclature. Now, most scientific names usually use Latin, but there's also Greek. It's usually written in italics. The first word is capitalized and the second word is lowercase. So, for example, Ursus martimus, Ursus is for bears, which is the genus, and then martimus is the species part of the name. Martimus has to do with the sea. But Ursus consists of all kinds of bears like brown bear or grizzly bear. Actually, the brown bear and the grizzly bear are part of the Ursus arctos. The scientific part of the name, Martimus, like I said before, has to do with the sea. So it's specific to polar bears. Scientific name for the red maple is Acer rubrum. Acer has to do with all maple trees. Rubrum has to do with the coloring, which is the red. So, in addition to naming species, biologists often try to organize or classify living and fossil species into larger groups that have a specific meaning, and this is called taxon or taxonomy. So, the science of naming and grouping organisms is called systematics. So, how did Linnaeus group species into larger taxa? Over time, he created a whole classification system, which is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. If you want a way to remember this, which you don't have to remember for the test, but if you want to, King Philip came over for good spaghetti or good soup. So Linnaeus also developed the system into a hierarchy or ranking, and depending how to place organisms into larger groups, he grouped species by their anatomical similarities and differences. Now, he just identified 4 levels in his original system. Over time, it turned into 7. So the scientific name here, I'm going to go backwards. So I'm going to go forward in a few slides and then go back. So here we have the kingdom Animalia, which includes all animals. So it says all multicellular animals are placed in this kingdom. Now we're going to get more specific. So now we're at phylum Chordata. Chordata has to do with your spinal cord and having a spinal cord. And this is a feature amongst all of the phylum Chordata. So notice before the starfish was there, that does not have a spine, so now it's out of phylum Chordata. Class has to do with Mammalia, so this is everything with hair, It's warm-blooded. It produces milk for their young. The snake doesn't do any of that, so it's out. The order is Artiodactylia, which includes camels and llamas, and this is hoofed animals with an even number of toes. So it takes out any hoofed animals with an odd number of toes or any animals that don't have hoofs. Then we have family Camelidae, which includes llamas and camels. Then we have the genus Camelus, which is only camels, and then Camelus bactrianus has to do with camels with 2 humps versus a camel with 1 hump, which is a Camelus dromedarius. Now, problems with this when it has to do with anatomical and with anatomical characterization, it's that just because 2 things look similar doesn't necessarily mean they are related, and they should be grouped together. So adult barnacles and limpets both live attached to rocks and have similar looking shells. Adult crabs don't look anything like barnacles and limpets, but based on these features, you would classify them, the limpets and barnacles together and the crab in a different group. But that's wrong. When we look at the DNA, we realize that they are more closely related. So the goal of classifying is to put them into specific groups and to see how we connect from evolutionary descent. So what started us off and then how we got to where we are. There, other than overall similarities and differences. So the concept of descent with modification led to phylogeny, which is phylogenetic trees, which we're going to see now. So this is a study of how living and extinct organisms are related to one another. So with the systematics, those members who are more closely related are usually closer on the similar branches versus those that aren't. So any organism that was a common ancestor would be like the trunk or further back in further branches. We're going to see that now. A clade is a group of species that include a single common ancestor and all the descendants of that ancestor, whether they're living or extinct. And then a clade has to be monophyletic. Mono means one. So this includes all species only descended from that common ancestor, and it can't include anything else. So a cladogram links these groups of species by showing how evolutionary lines or lineages branched off from common ancestors. So basically, this is like a limb on a tree, and it only has those organisms that are connected. So modern evolutionary classification uses the method called cladistic analysis to determine how they're related. So here, this is a speciation event in which an ancestral line branched off. So if we look here, think about us as primate ancestors, and we could, this is the primate ancestor, and this is where we turned out. So this is hominids, and this would be where other monkeys and great apes and things like that spread out to. So there's always a splitting event that shows the difference. So primate ancestor, so this would be like the great 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 grandfather, and this would be the kids, and then it would keep branching off. So here, a cladogram's branching indicates the degrees of relatedness. So here you have the ancestor, so this is the common ancestor, and because lines 3 and 4 share a common ancestor more recently with each other than do with 2, you know that 3 and 4 are more closely related. They like this branch right here. This is a big branch, so this is one of the limbs of the tree, and this is a branch off that limb. So they are more closely related, 3 and 4, than 2. 4 is the most closely related to the ancestor because it's split off into this limb. Then from that limb, 3 branched off. So it's more closely related to 4, and 4 is more closely related to the common ancestor. Hopefully you understood that. If not, ask me or Miss Samayoa during class. So lines 2, 3, and 4 are the most closely related compared to 1 because 1 branched off into another limb. So this is one other limb. This is another limb here, so 4. So while 1 is closely related to the common ancestor, it's not closely related to 2, 3, and 4, or not as closely related. So here, this cladogram represents the relationship amongst vertebrates. So that's anything with a spine. So note that in different terms of ancestry, amphibians are more closely related to mammals, which amphibians are right here, and this is the mammals because it's branching off the limb here, than ray-finned fish, which ray-finned fish are on a further branch. So hopefully you're understanding how this, if you picture it like a tree, that helps me understand a little bit better. So in order to, in contrast to Linnaean classification, cladistics, what they do is they focus on certain characteristics, and these are called derived characters when assigning organisms to clades. So a derived character is something that popped up in the most recent common ancestor of a particular lineage and was passed along to its descendants. So here we have Canis and we have Felis. So we have a lion and we have a coyote. So both these animals, these organisms, have 4 limbs. They're tetrapods. So you see all 4 limbs here. So hair, they both have hair, so they're both part of the clade Mammalia. But 4 limbs is not derived from mammals. So if it were, only mammals would have. So specialized shearing teeth is a derived characteristic for the clade Carnivora, which means that they are able to rip apart meat. So both coyote and lions are members of that. Neither hair nor 4 limbs is a derived character for this clade. So retractable claws is what differentiates Felidae, the cats, from the coyotes. So cats choose to scratch you because they can retract those claws or make them come out. So because distantly related organisms can lose the same character, systematists are often cautious about using the absence of a trait, so removing something. So both whales and snakes have lost their 4 limbs, but they're not closely related. Snakes are a member of the clade Reptilia, while whales are members of the clade Mammalia. So just because they both lost the 4 limbs doesn't mean that they are very closely related. So here, this cladogram shows a phylogeny of the cat family. So notice in this clade tetrapoda that every single one of these animals includes 4 limbs. So they all have 4 limbs. So amphibians have 4 limbs, reptiles have 4 limbs, marsupials have 4 limbs, dogs have 4 limbs, and cats have 4 limbs. So as we continue to move through this, there's going to be a derived character that each one of those animals has from moving to the right. So here, like I said, this 4-limbed derived characteristic has all of them having it. Now, if we move on to the next one, there's the amniotic egg, which is eggs with membranes. The amphibian does not have that, but the reptiles, the marsupials, the dogs, and the cats all do. In the clade Mammalia, everything has hair. This lizard or reptiles don't have hair, the amphibians don't have hair, but the rest of them do. If we move to the next part, specialized shearing teeth, which is a clade Carnivora, kangaroos are already terrifying because they're super strong. We don't need to give them teeth that can rip apart meat. So dogs and cats both have specialized shearing teeth. And then the next one, retractable claws, only has to do with clade Felidae, which is the cats. Dogs don't have retractable claws. So a clade has to be monophyletic, like I said before. It means that it all has to contain an ancestral species and all its descendants, and no species that are not descendants. Now, many traditional taxonomic groups do form clades, like Mammalia corresponds to clade Mammalia. So in other words, traditional groups do not form valid clades. Today's reptiles are all descended from a common ancestor. Modern birds are also descended from that ancestor. So class Reptilia does not include birds, therefore it's not a valid clade. Because here, as you can see, this is a class Aves. Aves is bird. This is not a clade. Clade Reptilia includes the birds, and then the clade Aves also includes birds on its own. Because birds and reptiles share a common ancestor, but it doesn't fit into the class, the Linnaean class Reptilia. I hope that helps you understand. It's not monophyletic. So while 2 clades do include birds, clade Aves, the birds themselves, and clade Reptilia, according to Callistics, a bird is a reptile. If you guys don't know, dinosaurs used to have feathers, and there is proof of this in an amber they found where it was part of a specific dinosaur and it contained feathers. So DNA sequences are also used in classification. So in general, the more derived characteristics two species shares, the more recently they shared a common ancestor and the more closely they are related. So the more DNA they have that's similar, like the whole conversation about us being 50% similar to bananas. We share a common ancestor, but it's kind of distant, like super distant. So all organisms, we all share information in DNA passed on from earlier generations. And as we keep getting more and more involved, we get further from that relationship of that common ancestor. So all eukaryotic cells, for example, have a mitochondria, and all mitochondria have their own DNA. You can follow along with your mother and how far back your mother's DNA went because of the mitochondria. You get your mitochondria from your mom. So all genes mutate over time, and shared genes contain differences that can be used as a derived characteristics. So similarities and differences in DNA can be used to develop hypotheses of the relationships. Now, what are the six kingdoms of life as they are now identified? This is as of now. There is the eubacteria, archaeobacteria, protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. So during Linnaeus' time, there was only two things. You were either an animal or a plant. So this is 1730. Animals were all organisms that moved from place to place and used energy for food, and plants were all green that did not move and got their energy from the sun. Now we know this does not reflect everything of life. So here in the 1700s, you could see that it was just plant and there was just animal. Then in the late 1800s, they added protista. Protista has always been the one where anything that doesn't belong with anything else, it goes there. So if it doesn't fit, it goes into Protista. Everything else that was green was plants, and then Animalia was anything that moved. In the 1950s, they added Monera. Monera has to do with any kind of bacteria. That's where they put that. Protista, once again, the weird ones. Fungi has to do with obviously fungus, plants, animals. And then in the 90s, we have eubacteria, which has to do with eukaryotic bacteria. Archaeobacteria, which has to do with any kind of bacteria that basically is extreme. So if it lives in extreme cold, extreme high, no oxygen, too much oxygen, any of those things, that's archaeobacteria. Protista, once again, weird ones. Fungi has to do with any kind of fungus, which means it breaks down any kind of organic matter. Then plants and animals. So these are the five. We now have six kingdoms. And then domain is above kingdom, and we have the archaea, we have bacteria, and then eukarya, which eukarya includes fungi, plants, animals, and kingdom protista. Quotes are put around protista because it's not monophyletic. Once again, it doesn't necessarily fit there, but it's where it fits the best. And this is what it looks like, and you can see the different types of why they classify it like that, and what kind of examples there are. Streptococcus is actually strep throat. So most of the time, and E. coli lives in your gut. So yeah. So tree of life, what does it show? I can actually show you a better tree of life than this one. So 1 second. So this is a website called One Zoom Tree of Life Explorer. And you can see eukaryotes, you can see the archaean eukaryotes. So this is all life, the eubacteria, and we can just click into it. So if I click here for eubacteria, you can see the different types right here and how many species there are. Now if I back out, you can see we're going to look at archaea and eukaryotes. And here you can see birds, you can see bugs, you can see different things, and there's 2 million species. And then here only eukaryotes, you can see all these different types right here. So we have plants, we have the morphia, we have so many different types of species here. So it's a really cool website to look at if you want to get into more detail. It's a little stuck right now. And then the archaeo group, which probably has to do with any kind of bacteria that is, like I said, lives in extreme environments. You can see it here. So pretty cool website to look at. So the domain bacteria has to do with any unicellular and prokaryotic. And there's specific terms. So like I said, all of this is just explaining more detail. You don't need to know all the specifics of every single one of these for your exam. You just need to kind of understand why we classify animals, and you need to know phylogenetic trees and clades and how that works. And hopefully with the assignment you will be doing, you'll understand it better.